Good evening, it is November 8th, 2011. Well, if you watched my video last time, I gave you a sample of my talk in front of a conference on the American Revolution. It was incredibly successful. Had a wonderful response. Several professors came up to me afterwards, including the dean of the college, and congratulated me, praised me for the work I did. It was in front of a room of about 70 people. I don't think I've given a talk like that in front of a group that big. Hopefully, maybe this is the beginning. But they loved it. Very receptive to what I was saying, and I couldn't be happier. And so thank you for the people who commented on my video. I took a few of your comments to heart and altered it a bit. I'm trying to get a recording of that talk available to me. Someone was recording it on a microphone. Chatted with a professor who knew the student who was taping it, so he's trying to get a hold of that for me. If I can get a hold of that, I'm going to post that on my YouTube channel. I changed a few things. I came up with a far stronger ending than the ending I had in the video I showed, and brought up a few other points too. But extremely successful. Like I said, I couldn't be happier with it. I feel really good right now about where I am with things. I gave another talk this last weekend at a conference in Alexandria, Virginia, in front of a group. This group was smaller. It was a conference of libertarian-leaning scholars, and they were all PhD students too. Probably about 150, 200 people at the conference. I'm not sure. Maybe less than that. But we broke up into groups of about 12, and so that was the size of the group I presented this following talk to. The talk deals with my dissertation, so I'm going to give that here. Now, keep in mind, the talk I'm about to give is a broad overview. I'm going to go into far more detail, of course, and draw on primary sources and those sort of things. So, but this should give you a good sense of where my dissertation is headed. And of course, my dissertation is on, if you didn't know, money, currency in the colonial America. I was originally going to go into the Revolution and up to the Constitution. Decided against that because that's too ambitious. This is ambitious enough. So, and I do need to complete this dissertation eventually. So, I'm keeping it to the colonial era. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the talk. And if you have any comments or whatever, I already delivered the talk, but I definitely would enjoy any recommendations or advice. So, anyway. By the way, I will be reading. I'll try not to read off the paper the entire time, but we'll see how I can do that. Money is perhaps the most understudied topic in the American historiography. This is true for the colonial period, revolutionary period, 19th century, and 20th century. Much of this, in my view, is due to the fact that, until very recently, currency issues have not played a major role in the public discourse. And so many historians have mistakenly assumed that it must not have played a major role in the public discourse of the past. For the last half century, very few historians have acknowledged the fact that money, or the medium of exchange, was a highly contested issue in earlier periods. In the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, historians did focus much of their attention on the money question, but this was in the midst of a passionate debate over the gold standard and populist calls for inflation. Since then, of course, historians have learned a whole lot more about their respective periods, and so these earlier histories are entirely inadequate for today's scholarship. As interesting as the Bank War or the Greenback Movement are, I've decided to focus my attention on money in the colonial period, which I find to be highly fascinating and full of public debate. My hope and aspiration is to reinsert money back into the historiography. Historians will certainly not agree with each other on all points, and various schools of interpretation will undoubtedly arise. But by placing money back into the narrative, we will do much to enhance our understanding of this period. My argument is simple. Money matters in the study of American history, and in this case, the colonial era. When the first English colonists arrived on the North American mainland, they brought few coins with them and had not yet developed a staple export. Because the migrants desired a standard of living that was higher, or at the very least equal, to the country that they had left behind, they demanded imported goods from England and the European continent, goods that they could not yet produce in the New World. Silver and gold, of course, was the currency of the Atlantic world at this time, and if Americans could not pay for imported goods with an equal amount in exports, they had to make up the difference in specie, that is, silver or gold. Virginia responded by growing tobacco for export. Massachusetts engaged in a wide range of activities that included shipping, fishing, and raising provisions for the plantations of the West Indies. South Carolina grew rice and indigo. The middle colonies produced wheat and other cereal goods. The export of staples to the outside world meant the importation of Spanish silver dollars, known as pieces of 8, which soon became the most widely circulated coin in North America. Spanish silver permeated the Atlantic region due to Spain's conquest of the mineral-rich regions of Mexico and Peru. Even with the development of staple products, however, the balance of trade was weighed heavily against the colonists. I did better than this in my presentation. Throughout the period, there were constant complaints of silver shortages. This was primarily due to two factors. First, they continued to demand more imported goods than what they had produced for export. And so silver, to make up for that difference, was constantly leaving the country. Second, the British mercantilist system, culminating in the Navigation Acts of the mid-17th century, was designed in order to drain silver from the colonies to England, enriching the mother country. England didn't possess colonies just for fun. They meant to profit by them. For example, an example of the Navigation Acts, Virginians were prohibited from trading tobacco to any other country but Britain. They could not, for example, trade with the Dutch or the French, who also demanded tobacco. Instead, they had to ship tobacco directly to London, and then London merchants would sell that tobacco to France and Holland and Germany and other parts throughout Europe for a price that was higher than what they bought it for in Virginia. Restrictions such as these, and there were many of them, did indeed harm the colonists and prevent the importation of additional silver. Americans responded to this problem in a variety of ways. Some condemned European exports as mere luxuries and insisted that their fellow colonists either produce the goods themselves or practice frugality in order to keep silver within the colony. Naturally, this was not the most popular solution. Few people like to be told that they need to consume less and produce more. A more common expedient in the 17th century was the use of alternative commodities as money. In Virginia, tobacco was used as a medium of exchange for nearly 150 years. The Virginia government even issued tobacco notes backed by tobacco, 100% reserves. In New England, corn, beaver skins, and wampum were used as money. In South Carolina, rice and deer skins operated as money. Remember, this is the 17th century. All of these commodities, at one point or another, were even declared legal tender in the payment of debts. Unfortunately, these non-metallic commodity monies were highly deficient in relation to silver and gold. Some were perishable, others were bulky. Still others fluctuated wildly in value, and some, like tobacco, had different grades of quality. As Carl Menger and other economists, including economists in the 18th century, have illustrated, silver and gold possess certain properties that make them more useful as media of exchange than other goods. Properties such as durability. They're not very bulky. They have a high proportion of value in relation to their size. You can stamp them. Various other properties that have been explored by these economists that other commodities like tobacco do not share. At the turn of the 18th century, another expedient was resorted to. Colonial assemblies artificially raised the legal value of silver coins. The method was fairly simple. The sterling value of a Spanish dollar, that is a piece of 8, was 4 shillings 6 pence. Colonists hoped that by declaring the legal value of that coin to be, say, 5 shillings or 8 shillings, more coins would then be brought into the colony due to its higher nominal value. This form of inflation might have worked in a short run, but prices soon rose in proportion, and other colonies responded in kind, so the experiment ultimately failed in achieving its goal of keeping silver within the colony. Enter paper money. In 1690, Massachusetts was the first colony to emit paper as a form of currency. Other colonies soon followed, and by 1720, New York, the Carolinas, and all of New England had paper currency within their borders. The first paper emissions came in order to finance wars against the natives and the French. Legislatures figured out that it was far easier and faster to finance a war by printing money rather than going through the whole process of taxing its citizens, many of whom possessed little money to begin with. The legislature would print the paper and then use it to pay soldiers and suppliers. The currency would then circulate throughout the economy, and within a few years the legislature would call it back in through taxes. The promise that the legislature would ultimately redeem the paper for taxes, in theory, was supposed to uphold its value, since the citizens knew that they would ultimately need it for tax payments. Unfortunately, the legislatures often postponed these taxes, and the amounts issued were often so large that the value of some of these paper notes, within a few years, fell considerably. New England and the Carolinas experienced the highest inflation. Later, during the French and Indian War of the 1750s, virtually all of the colonies issued paper money in order to finance the conflict. There was another way, however, in which the assembly might issue paper for circulation, and this method soon became quite popular. The Public Land Bank, also known as the Loan Office, emitted paper currency, or bills of credit, to loan out to farmers, merchants, artisans, and other property holders. Land banks were not banks in the traditional sense. They did not accept deposits, but they did offer credit to those the board considered qualified. The borrower had to mortgage his land, real estate, and other property as collateral for the loan, which he received in a newly printed currency, and would then circulate it throughout the economy. These securities had to be valued at often had to be valued at double the amount of the loan. For instance, if a planter wished to borrow £100, and by pounds I don't mean weight, I mean the monetary unit, he had to mortgage £200 of his property. This was done, of course, in case of default. In many cases, the loan would run for as long as 7 years, with the borrower paying yearly installments on his debt, plus 3 to 5% interest. Upon receiving the notes and payment for debts, the Public Loan Office was expected to retire or burn the paper. This, again in theory, was supposed to preserve the value of the notes. Massachusetts passed its first land bank in 1714, and other colonies soon followed. Between 1714 and 1740, after the passage of multiple land banks, Massachusetts notes depreciated by roughly 500%. Rhode Island became notorious for her land banks, establishing a total of 9 in a few decades, and her notes depreciated by 1,000%. There's evidence that there was a strong debtor element in Rhode Island that intentionally desired inflation in order to lessen the value of their debts. The Carolinas experienced similar inflation, particularly North Carolina. Virginia was the only colony to not engage in the land banking business. Other colonies fared better. The middle colonies, notably Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, were far more moderate in their loan office issues and were exceptionally careful in making sure that payments were made in a timely fashion. Loan office paper in the middle colonies depreciated at the outset slightly, roughly 30%, but then maintained a stable value throughout the remainder of the colonial period. Benjamin Franklin was an outspoken proponent of the land bank in Pennsylvania. His first work of a political nature was in support of legislation in 1729 establishing a second bank, the first one being authorized in 1723. What's fascinating about the loan offices in the middle colonies is the enthusiastic support that they received, not from indebted farmers, but from the mercantile community, many of whom possessed considerable wealth. Massachusetts is also interesting because on 2 separate occasions there were proposals for a private land bank, independent of government, and run on the same principles. In 1714, there was a big push by Boston merchants for a private note issuing institution, but the legislature stepped in and installed a government one instead. In 1740, Boston merchants tried again and succeeded in establishing a private land bank and even began issuing notes, but the British Parliament stepped in and intervened. The Currency Act of 1741 banned any private note-issuing institutions from operating in the colonies. As the 18th century wore on, the British government and London merchants became increasingly annoyed with the inflation of New England and the Carolinas. Parliament soon took it upon themselves to resolve the matter. The Currency Act of 1751 barred the New England colonies from making paper money legal tender in the payment of debts. What that means was New England colonies were still allowed to emit paper currency, but they could not require creditors to accept it. In 1764, following the French and Indian War, Parliament went one step further and extended the legal tender ban to all of the colonies, not just New England. This outraged the merchants of Philadelphia and New York, who acknowledged that inflation was a problem in New England, but insisted that Pennsylvania and New York had acted responsibly. Franklin himself sailed to London in order to address Parliament personally on the issue. It soon became clear, however, that the notes would still circulate even without legal tender status, and so by the eve of the Revolution, tension between the mother country and her colonies on the subject of currency had died down considerably. Of course, other subjects arose: taxes, representation, the Quartering Acts, and others. Consequently, there's no mention of currency in the Declaration of Independence. Now, my dissertation stops here, but if you allow me another minute or two, I'd like to conclude with an epilogue explaining what happens afterwards. When fighting between the British and the colonists first began in 1775, the Continental Congress had virtually no funds to pay for troops and supplies. Not surprisingly, they resorted to the old expedient of printing money in order to finance the war. They argued, perhaps correctly, that they had no choice. The notes were called dollars because Congress declared them to be equal in value to the Spanish silver dollar. This, of course, was not the case in reality. Between 1775 and 1777, the continental dollar depreciated by degrees, but between 1779 and 1781, the value fell dramatically, and a period of hyperinflation ensued. By the early 1780s, the notes were practically worthless, and the people responded by resorting to barter or circulating the few silver coins that remained in the colony. After independence was officially won in 1783, the sovereign states began authorizing their own land banks again, run by the newly independent state governments. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 was over this very issue. The debtor farmers desired that the Massachusetts legislature emit more paper currency in order to ease their debts. Rhode Island, of course, was not shy in her emissions in the 1780s. The Articles of Confederation allowed the various states to issue bills of credit, and this was a deep concern for the draftees of the Constitution, notably James Madison. As a result, the Constitution explicitly banned the states from emitting bills of credit and declared that only gold and silver could operate as legal tender. The mere fact that the Constitution was ratified by popular democratic conventions attests to the notion that Americans had grown weary of fiat currency after the hyperinflation of the war and the confusion of the 1780s. Many, though not all, of the Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution for this very reason, and it's no coincidence that Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution, doing so in 1791. In the first several decades of the Republic under the new Constitution, private banks, by the hundreds, that issued paper notes redeemable on demand in gold and silver, quickly spread throughout the country. And so this satisfied much of the demand for credit that existed in the previous era on the part of farmers and merchants. New debates about the national bank, bank charters, who should receive charters, should we have free banking, etc., and the propriety of redeemable banknotes issued on a fractional reserve basis soon filled the public discourse. The public land bank was now relegated to the dustbin of history, but in the colonial period, it was at the center of intense political debate. All right, well, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Give me some advice, some comments. I think I'm running out of time, so I've got to end it here. But thank you for watching. Bye.